I was thinking about this earlier. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of precision.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very clinical, very straightforward.
Oh, it's almost like engineering. Like if you fall off a ladder and break your arm, you go to the hospital. The x-ray shows that jagged white line on the bone, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, there it is. There's the problem.
Right. It's a very binary way of looking at the body.
Okay.
I mean, the bone is broken or it isn't. You have an infection or you don't.
Mm.
We really find comfort in that kind of structural, defined biology.
Exactly. It kind of implies that the body is a machine, right? Like it has a factory setting, and
Yeah.
medicine is just the act of, well, restoring that setting. But what happens when you step entirely outside of that framework?
That is where things get genuinely terrifying.
Seriously. Because what happens when you enter a world of extreme biological manipulation, a place where radical life extension isn't just a theory but a perfected science, suddenly that x-ray machine is just, it's entirely useless.
Yeah, you're no longer looking at a diagnostic landscape where the rules of biology even apply anymore.
Right. The boundaries between healing someone and harming them, or between survival and utter monstrosity, they just completely evaporate.
Because in that kind of environment, the body is no longer viewed as a machine to be fixed. It's viewed as raw material, period.
Mm.
When the limits of biology are completely removed, the very definition of what constitutes a living being becomes remarkably fluid.
And incredibly dangerous.
Oh, without a doubt.
Which brings us to today's mission. And I have to warn you right up front, if you're listening to this, while we are diving into a stack of speculative fiction today, the concepts we are going to unpack are going to get uncomfortably real.
Very real.
Yeah, we're opening up excerpts from a text titled Architects of Agony, the Homunculus Covens of Cumorah.
And, to frame this properly, we really need to understand that the homunculus covens are not merely like standard antagonists in a sci-fi setting.
Right, they're not just guys with laser guns.
It's exactly. Within the lore of the 41st millennium, they represent the absolute darkest, most unfettered extreme of biological science imaginable. They are the ultimate flesh sculptors of the Eldari race, and they operate out of this hidden, extra-dimensional dark city known as Cumorah.
And the reason we're doing a deep dive on this specific super dark corner of fictional lore is because, well, buried within these texts is a massive, terrifying thought experiment.
It really is.
The core question we're tackling today is this. What happens to a society when the absolute fear of death is entirely conquered, but every single shred of morality is discarded in the process?
This is an incredible question to explore because it pushes our own understanding of medical ethics to a complete breaking point.
Right.
I mean, we often take for granted how much of our human empathy is anchored by our shared mortality.
Okay.
When you completely remove mortality from the equation, you remove the primary consequence of violence.
So let's just jump right into this first major concept from the text, this complete redefinition of life and death. Because the text introduces these homunculi as the elite masters of biology within Drukhariya society. But to really understand them, we have to look at where they came from.
Yeah, the historical context provided in the text is really crucial here. It mentions that their true origins are, somewhat shrouded, but they likely date back to an event known as the fall of the ancient Eldar Empire.
And the fall wasn't just a political collapse.
Right.
We're talking about an apocalyptic, species-wide cataclysm that essentially shattered their entire civilization.
Yes.
The homunculi are the survivors of that apocalypse.
And just think about the deep psychological scarring of surviving something on that scale.
Mm.
When your entire civilization is wiped out overnight, it forces a fundamental shift in how you conceptualize survival.
Oh, for sure.
For the ancient beings that would become the homunculi, survival couldn't just mean hiding in a bunker or fleeing to a new planet. It meant mastering the very biological components that defined existence. Their entire obsession became cheating death.
And according to the text, they didn't just try to cheat it, they utterly defeated it. The text describes them as being, quote, functionally immortal. But it's the mechanism of this immortality that really, it just stopped me in my tracks.
It's staggering.
Right, because they don't just live a long time. They can regenerate their entire bodies from even the smallest microscopic scrap of living tissue.
And I want to isolate a specific phrase the text uses to describe this, actually. It calls it a complete rejection of the fear of death. We really need to analyze what that psychological pivot actually means in practice.
Yeah, let's unpack that.
They haven't just defeated death as a medical obstacle. They have made the very concept of death entirely irrelevant to their daily existence.
Which is just a wild concept to wrap your head around. It's not like they found a cure for a specific disease or, they wear really good armor. They fundamentally removed the consequence of physical destruction.
Right, and when you remove that consequence, a profound philosophical shift occurs within a culture. Think about how we view the human body. Flesh, bone, blood. We treat these things as sacred because they're fragile.
Right, they're finite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They are the irreplaceable vessels of life. But to a homunculus, because they can regrow anything from almost nothing, flesh and bone lose all inherent value. They cease to be sacred, and instead, they become mere raw materials.
They become a canvas.
Precisely. A canvas for their twisted art.
I was trying to build a mental bridge to this, to somehow contextualize it for our own world. And the closest I could get is looking at modern extreme biohackers.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
You know the ones, the people who are like implanting RFID chips into their hands to unlock their cars or experimenting with unregulated genetic therapies in makeshift labs. But I want you to imagine those exact same biohackers, except they're operating in a universe completely unburdened by medical ethics boards
Right.
or basic human empathy, or even the laws of physics as we understand them.
The biohacker analogy is a really great starting point, actually.
Yeah.
But we have to scale it up exponentially. I mean, a human biohacker is usually driven by a desire to transcend a natural human limit, like extending their lifespan by a decade or enhancing a sense.
Right, it's usually practical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Take that exact same drive, but scale it up by thousands of years of unbroken, inherited genius, then strip away literally any moral framework that dictates we shouldn't conduct an experiment because it causes pain.
Oh.
To the homunculi, suffering isn't a deterrent. It's just another data point. It's just another color on their palette.
Okay, but this brings up a massive question for me, and I want to push back on the mechanics of this regeneration a bit, because it feels like a biological paradox to me.
How so?
Well, the text explicitly says they can regenerate from the smallest scrap of living tissue. So what does this actually mean for their identity? Let's say a homunculus gets completely obliterated in an explosion,
Okay.
and the only thing left is, like, a single severed finger, or just a splatter of blood on a wall. If they regrow an entire, fully functioning adult body from that single drop of blood, are they even the same person when they wake up?
You're touching on the classic ship of Theseus paradox here, but applying it to hyper-advanced biology.
Exactly.
If you replace every single plank of wood on a ship over time, is it still the same ship? If you regrow an entire biological organism from a single surviving cell, is it the exact same entity, or is it just a perfect copy that simply believes it's the original?
Right. Where does the original entity end and the biological replica begin? Does that microscopic scrap of tissue somehow retain thousands of years of memories? Does it keep their specific dark genius, their personality?
Well, the source text strongly implies a seamless, unbroken continuity of self. It talks about them maintaining absolute power over millennia,
Okay.
and you simply cannot maintain a stranglehold on absolute power in a society as incredibly treacherous and politically lethal as Camorra if you are waking up with a blank slate or a fractured identity every time your body has to be regenerated.
That makes sense. But so how does that actually work mechanically? I'm trying to visualize the biology of this.
If we extrapolate from the lore, the implication is that their mastery of biological manipulation is so absolute that consciousness, memory, and identity are no longer localized in a single organ, like a brain.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They have somehow managed to encode their entire consciousness into every single cell of their being, perhaps through some form of hyperdense epigenetic memory storage, or maybe a decentralized quantum-level nervous system that exists holographically across their entire cellular structure.
Hold on, so you're saying they don't really have a brain in the way we think of it?
Not a centralized one that holds a monopoly on their identity, no. If a single cell can rebuild the whole, then the blueprint for the entire mind must exist within that cell.
That is deeply unsettling.
It really is.
It means their self is entirely decentralized. It completely subverts the old saying about, cutting off the head of the snake. If you cut off the head of the snake, every single individual scale on its body has a backup copy of the snake's entire operating system, just waiting to rebuild the whole animal.
That's a very visceral way to put it, but it's accurate.
Hey.
And this total decentralized mastery over their own biology leads us directly into the next logical step of their evolution as a society. Because if death is no longer a threat to the homunculi themselves, the natural question becomes, how do they weaponize that power against a society that still fears death.
Exactly. If you invent the ultimate shield, the first thing you do is figure out how to use it as a sword.
Precisely.
How do they leverage the cure for death? And that brings us to the political economy of Camorra and this concept of the economics of resurrection.
This is where the sheer biological horror of the covens transitions into a terrifying form of political and economic dominance. Because the text outlines that in Drukhari society, the homunculi are the sole keepers of this specific technology. They hold the monopoly on resurrection.
And we aren't talking about, like, advanced trauma care here. We are talking about literal resurrection of the dead.
Correct. The text specifically notes that an archon, which is the title given to a leader of a ruling cabal, can be completely restored to life from the most grievous fatal wounds, provided a genetic sample of them is preserved and brought to the covens.
So let's pause and look at the society this is happening in, just for context. An archon is essentially a warlord, a career politician, and a ruthless mafia boss all rolled into one.
Yeah, that's a good summary.
They live in a city where assassination is basically a legitimate form of career advancement. For someone like that, being able to buy a literal extra life is the ultimate asset. But the text makes it very clear this isn't a public utility. The price they charge is astronomical.
Highly exorbitant, and deliberately so. The homunculi rarely, if ever, give their services freely. The text lists the currencies they deal in. We're talking vast amounts of wealth, millions of captive slaves for their experiments, or, and this is by far the most dangerous currency, a binding future favor.
A blank check signed over to an immortal flesh sculptor who doesn't possess a conscience. That sounds like the worst possible deal you could make.
It is the ultimate Faustian bargain, but you have to view it from the Archon's perspective. If the alternative is permanent, absolute death in a universe that is incredibly hostile to your soul, it's a bargain they will make every single time, without hesitation.
Wow. Yeah, I guess you're right.
And this dynamic creates what the text brilliantly refers to as a web of obligation. I want us to really dissect this web because it's the foundation of their power.
Yeah, let's pull that apart,
Right.
because it completely changes how we should view their role in this society.
Right. If you look at the macro structure of Camorra, this resurrection service isn't just a transactional medical procedure. It functions as the ultimate structural power dynamic. The source text explains that the homunculus covens exist as the third major pillar of Drukhari society. They operate in parallel with the political cabals and the martial witch cults.
Okay, so you have the politicians passing the laws and managing the trade, the military cults handling the warfare and arena spectacles, and then the doctors.
Basically, yes.
But the doctors hold the ultimate trump card over the other two.
Precisely. Because the ruling archons owe their literal lives, past, present, and potentially future, to the homunculi, the covens effectively act as an untouchable shadow government.
That is insane.
Consider the logistics of rebellion against them. You can't assassinate a homunculus because they will simply regrow in their laboratory and remember exactly who killed them.
Right.
And you certainly can't define them politically because the next time a rival assassin comes for you, the homunculus might just decide that they, accidentally incinerated your genetic backup sample.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Archon. One of the neophytes knocked over your petri dish while sweeping. So tragic. Best of luck with that poison dart.
Exactly. They have successfully weaponized their society's dependence on survival. They are renowned, as the text states, for their masterful manipulation and their ability to play the various cabals against one another.
Okay, but I have a major bone to pick with this strategy.
Oh.
If I'm reading this text and I see that the homunculi are this untouchable and they literally hold the keys to life and death, and the archons are absolutely terrified of them, why on earth do they bother playing the background?
What do you mean?
Why be a shadow government? If you can grant immortality, why don't you just march into the high spires and rule Camorra directly? Why not put a homunculus on the throne and just be done with the political maneuvering?
It's a completely logical question from a human perspective, but it assumes that their desires align with standard human political ambition.
Okay.
We tend to equate supreme power with visible leadership. But this raises a fascinating question about what power actually means to an immortal being. Let's look back at the phrasing in the text. It states that the covens represent a different approach to survival.
Right, meaning they fundamentally don't value what the politicians value.
Exactly. The text contrasts them directly against the other factions. The covens prioritize immortality, the mastery of the flesh, and esoteric knowledge over the overt political dominance of the cabals, or the martial glory of the witches.
So for a homunculus sitting on a throne, managing real estate, taxing trade routes, dealing with minor insurrections, that's all just busy work.
It's administrative friction. It's messy, it's constantly dangerous, and frankly, to a being that has lived for thousands of years and views the manipulation of DNA as the highest art form, it is incredibly boring.
They just don't care about taxes.
No, they actively choose to outsource the messy, day-to-day governance to the cabals. The archons get to feel important, they get to wear the fancy crowns and fight the visible wars, while the homunculi get exactly what they actually desire.
Which is an uninterrupted laboratory.
Exactly. Endless resources, a steady supply of exotic test subjects provided as payment by the cabals, and the absolute peace and quiet required to focus purely on their twisted science. They don't want the throne. They want unlimited, unquestioned grant funding with zero ethical oversight. Why be the king when you can own the king?
Wow, that is a terrifyingly pragmatic way to look at it. They are the ultimate shadow board of directors. They let the CEO take all the public heat and handle the press conferences while they sit down in the R&D department doing literally whatever they want, completely untouchable.
And to truly grasp the horror of what they're actually doing down in those uninterrupted laboratories, we have to examine their internal societal structure. We need to look at how they organize themselves, how they teach their craft, and how they define their deeply twisted version of art.
Which transitions perfectly into the third major theme of the text, cults of flesh.
Yes.
The text goes into some real detail about how a coven actually operates on a day-to-day basis, and the description it uses is just a wild combination of words. It says a homunculus coven is simultaneously a guild, a school, and a cult of personality.
That specific combination of terms, guild, school, cult, is incredibly loaded. We really should deconstruct that intersection because those three things usually operate under very different incentives.
Yeah, let's unpack that because to me, a guild and a cult seem fundamentally at odds. A guild is an economic institution, right? It's about protecting trade secrets, setting prices, and maintaining an economic monopoly, like the stonemasons or the blacksmiths in the Middle Ages. It's purely business.
Correct. The guild aspect of a coven exists to ensure that no one else in Camorra can ever undercut their monopoly on resurrection or flesh sculpting. They strictly control the supply of this knowledge, which means they can dictate whatever price they want.
Right.
But then you layer in the element of a school. This implies an intense hierarchical master-apprentice relationship. Knowledge isn't just shared openly. It is aggressively gated and doled out only to those who prove themselves worthy.
And then on top of the monopoly and the strict schooling, you throw in a cult of personality, which demands fanatical, religious-level devotion to the leaders.
So what you end up with is an absolute economic monopoly, protected by fanatical religious zealotry and structured through rigorous academia. The hierarchy the text outlines reflects this perfectly. At the very top, you have the homunculus coven's master. The text notes that this title grants them immense power, prestige, and influence over a specific enclave or laboratory network.
So they are the CEO of the guild, the headmaster of the school, and the high priest of the cult, all wrapped into one terrifying package.
Precisely. Beneath them, you have the homunculus artisans. These are the established practitioners who share the secrets of their craft and run their own experiments. You can think of them as the tenured professors.
The tenured professors of agony.
Exactly. And at the absolute bottom of the pyramid are the homunculus neophytes. These are the initiates, desperately trying to learn the basics of flesh crafting. And crucially, the text explicitly states that all of these lower tiers are bound by incredibly strict, punitive contracts to their superiors.
I was trying to build an analogy for this structure in my head. The best I could come up with is imagining a twisted mix of an Ivy League university and an exclusive, high-end, avant-garde art studio. But instead of working with clay or marble or paint, their medium is living, screaming tissue.
That is a highly accurate comparison, and you bring up a very important word there, art. The text states that they view themselves not merely as scientists or doctors, but as artists, poets, and philosophers of agony, actively sculpting flesh into what they consider perfect forms.
I have to say, this constant use of the word art throughout the text is profoundly disturbing to me.
It's meant to be.
Why do they insist on calling it art? Why frame unimaginable, horrific torture as poetry? Is it just pure sadism?
It's actually more insidious than pure sadism. It serves as a mechanism for profound intellectual detachment.
What do you mean?
By framing their atrocities as art or philosophy, they elevate their actions above mere butchery. Think about it.
Right.
A butcher kills an animal for a practical purpose meat. A conventional torturer inflicts pain for a practical purpose, extracting information, or perhaps acting out of anger and sadism.
Right.
But an artist is pursuing a higher aesthetic truth. An artist is seeking perfection for its own sake. By adopting this language, the homunculi indolently detach themselves from the horror they are inflicting. It entirely sanitizes the grotesque reality of their actions in their own minds.
It's the ultimate rationalization. If you can successfully convince yourself that you are writing a brilliant symphony using someone's nervous system as the instrument, you don't have to feel bad about the screaming, you aren't hurting someone, you are just critiquing the pitch, the timbre, and the resonance of the scream, you're just tweaking the acoustics.
Precisely. The text notes that their vision extends far beyond mere survival or utility. They are actively creating grotesque, living art pieces in their laboratories, simply to see what aesthetic boundaries they can push.
Okay, speaking of those art pieces, I have to point out an absolutely glaring omission in our source material that honestly gave me a nervous chuckle when I first read through it.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
The text spends all this time building up how horrifying their creations are, right? And it says, quote, "Their iconic creations include," and then it just abruptly cuts off. There is literally a blank space. The excerpt just ends that paragraph.
A sudden, very conspicuous redaction in the archives.
Yes. And honestly, as a reader, I am profoundly relieved at this censorship. Because I want you, just sitting there listening to this, to take a second and try to imagine what constitutes perfection to a being that sees agonizing pain as a philosophical pursuit.
It's better not to.
Exactly. Imagine a being that has had thousands of uninterrupted years to practice sculpting bone, muscle, and nerves. Whatever was on that redacted list, I am perfectly happy leaving it entirely to the theater of the mind. My imagination is doing plenty of terrible work all on its own without needing the specifics.
It is a well-known principle that the unseen often holds the most terror. However, while the specific list of their individual smaller-scale creations is omitted from this excerpt, the text does give us one incredibly detailed, massive-scale example of their flesh sculpting.
It does.
And it's not a creature they keep locked in a cage or put on display in a gallery. It's the very place where they live.
Right, and to conduct this level of grotesque large-scale artistry requires a very specific type of studio space. Which brings us to the most surreal part of this deep dive. The Altered. A city made of meat.
The Altered is perhaps the most mind-bending architectural concept in this entire archive. The text describes it as the primary, secure base of operations for many of the covens. It is a specific region hidden deep within the dark city, serving as a permanent testament to their twisted artistry.
I had to read the description of this place 3 times because my brain simply refused to process the physical geometry of it. The text says the Altered is a massive, segmented, snake-like creature, a gargantuan living entity that has been stretched out, diced, and recombined into a nightmarish organic city.
We really need to dive deep into the biological logistics and architectural horror of this concept because it goes far beyond a simple building. It is a masterclass in absolute biological dominance.
I was trying to picture the engineering of this. I mean, imagine being a normal city planner. Usually you look at a topographical map, you order some concrete, some steel beams, you lay down some PVC pipes for plumbing.
Standard construction.
Right. Now imagine a city planner who ignores all of that. Instead, they go out into the void, find a gargantuan cosmic-scale earthworm or leviathan, and they slice it into habitable sections. They hollow out the dense muscle tissue to make hallways. They repurpose the massive arterial veins to serve as plumbing and waste disposal.
Just horrifying.
And they force millions of people in laboratories to inhabit these segments while the creature is still fundamentally alive.
The bioengineering required is staggering to think about. You'd have to constantly manage the creature's immune responses so it doesn't try to digest the inhabitants.
Oh, God, yeah. I didn't even think about the white blood cells.
Exactly. You'd have to force nutrient loops to keep the tissue from necrotizing, all while suppressing its higher nervous system so it doesn't thrash around and destroy the laboratories. It is horrifying, yet from the twisted perspective of a homunculus, it is brutally, elegantly efficient.
It's the ultimate flex.
Exactly. It perfectly encapsulates their core ethos. To the covens, absolutely everything biological, no matter how massive, how ancient, or how sentient, exists merely to be subjugated, hollowed out, and repurposed for their convenience.
Wow.
The altered is not just infrastructure. It is a permanent living monument to their absolute mastery over life. They took a living Leviathan and forced it to become real estate.
But here is a point of pushback, or at least a massive philosophical contradiction that I found in the text regarding the altered. The source explicitly states that they use this massive, horrific flesh city to pursue their craft, quote, in peace. It says the isolation of the altered protects them from the constant gang wars and political conflicts of the rest of Camorra. Am I the only one who finds that to be the ultimate sickening irony?
I don't think it's irony at all, actually. Why do you see it that way?
Because they are the architects of absolute, unyielding agony. They spend their entire immortal lives unraveling nervous systems, peeling biology apart, and turning excruciating pain into what they call poetry. Yet when they clock out for the day or when they set up their highly sensitive lab equipment, they demand a quiet, secure, peaceful, gated community to do their work.
Well, when you put it like that,
It's like a prolific serial killer demanding a nice, quiet suburban cul-de-sac so the neighbors' barking dogs don't interrupt their focus. The cognitive dissonance is staggering.
I understand why you see it as a contradiction. But that juxtaposition you've identified is actually the key to understanding their true nature. You seize on this concept of peace, and it actually reveals the underlying foundational terror of the covens.
How so?
It's not the blood, or the gore, or the screaming that makes them truly existentially terrifying. It's the quiet, sterile, clinical environment in which the screaming happens.
You mean the contrast between the chaos of the subject and the calm of the observer?
Exactly. Think about violence in our own history. When violence happens in a war zone or in a gang conflict, it is inherently chaotic. It's driven by adrenaline, fear, anger, and desperation. It is messy.
Right.
But when unimaginable systematic torture happens in a peaceful, secure, perfectly well-lit laboratory, it implies a level of premeditation, control, and emotional detachment that is deeply alien to the human mind. The absolute peace of the altered is precisely what allows them to be so meticulous.
I see. They don't want the messy, unpredictable gang wars of the Cabal spilling into their sterile workspace because a stray bullet might ruin a delicate 400-year-long experiment on a single nerve cluster.
Exactly.
They need absolute pin-drop quiet in their environment so they can hear the subtle, microscopic nuances of the agony they're orchestrating.
Which brings us to the final and most profound section of our analysis today, the underlying psychology of all of this. The text states very clearly that the homunculus covens are the embodiment of a very specific existential fear.
The text calls it the greatest fear of the wider galaxy, the triumph of scientific curiosity over all morality.
I want to spend some time contrasting the homunculi with typical antagonists we see in fiction, or even the historical tyrants we study in our own human history. Usually, when we look at vast systems of cruelty, oppression, or violence, they are driven by identifiable, relatable human emotions. Anger, vengeance, a desperate lust for political power, ideological or religious fanaticism.
Right. Usually someone is hurting someone else because they hate them, or because they want to steal their land, or because they feel threatened by them and want security. Even if the action is evil, there is a recognizable emotional engine driving the violence. We can understand why they're doing it, even if we condemn it.
Exactly. But the homunculi are terrifying precisely because that recognizable emotional engine is completely, totally absent. They are profoundly indifferent to the suffering they cause. They're not acting out of malice or hatred or vengeance against their subjects. As the text states, they are driven by a cold, clinical, unimpassioned pursuit of knowledge. They are just curious.
It really is the ultimate perversion of the scientific method. The method says you observe, you hypothesize, you test, and you conclude. But the homunculi never, ever stop to ask if the test itself is evil. They just want to see what happens.
It is the difference between immorality and amorality. And an amoral mindset can be so much more destructive than an immoral one.
How so?
An immoral person knows they are doing something wrong and chooses to do it anyway, which usually requires some kind of mental justification or limit. An amoral entity simply doesn't recognize the concept of wrong. The very idea of ethics is as meaningless to them as a color is to someone born blind.
Wow. The analogy that popped into my head while reading this section was a scientist with a butterfly.
Okay, let's hear it.
If a predator in the wild, like a bird, hunts a butterfly and eats it, that is a violent act, but it's natural. The bird is hungry, it needs to survive. The violence has a purpose rooted in nature. But imagine a human scientist who catches a butterfly, pins it alive to a corkboard, and just watches it struggle. They aren't hungry, they don't hate the butterfly, they aren't angry at it. They just want to observe exactly how long the wings keep flapping under lethal stress. They're just taking notes on the struggle. The total absence of malice makes the act feel infinitely worse.
That is a phenomenal encapsulation of their psychology.
Yeah.
Now, to truly grasp the covens, take that butterfly analogy and scale it up to sentient, intelligent beings, and scale the corkboard up to a laboratory complex that spans the inside of a living city.
Shudder.
That is the daily reality of the homunculus covens. The text concludes with a deeply chilling summary of this exact concept. It says, the greatest terror they present is not the monster that jumps out of the dark and kills you.
But the monster that keeps you alive, screaming for an eternity simply so it can study the mechanics of your vocal cords.
It's a profound subversion of our most basic biological drives. Every instinct ingrained in a living creature tells us to survive, to fear death, to fight for just one more day of life. But the homunculi have created a paradigm where death is actually a mercy. It is a privilege that they actively deny to their subjects. They have taken the universal will to live and turned survival into the ultimate punishment.
Okay, but I have a major philosophical pushback here, and I'm curious to hear your take on this. I have a real question about the long-term viability of a society built entirely on this premise.
Let's hear it. Where do you see the flaw?
Well, if they have achieved this absolute mastery over life, if they can live forever, regenerate from a single microscopic cell, cure any wound, and they have literally all the time in the universe, does their society actually become completely stagnant?
Stagnant in what way? They are constantly experimenting.
Yes, but to what end? Look at human innovation in our own history. It is almost always driven by time pressure or the threat of death. We invent medicine because we are dying and we want to stop it. We invent better agriculture because winter is coming, and if we don't, we will starve.
That's a fair point.
Right. We build shelters because the elements will kill us. Our mortality is the fire under our collective feet. It forces progress. Without the pressure of time or the ultimate consequence of death, does true innovation eventually just die out? Are the homunculi just endlessly rearranging flesh in circles because they have absolute nothing left to actually strive for?
That is a brilliant observation, and it cuts to the core of their tragic existence. It suggests that their horrifying art is actually a symptom of profound immortal boredom.
Exactly.
Think about it. When you have solved the ultimate puzzle of biology, how to not die, what is left to solve, you have to invent new puzzles just to pass the centuries. You create artificial complexities because the natural ones are gone.
You start splicing snake DNA with city architecture just to see if you can, because regular architecture is too easy now.
Exactly. Their endless pursuit of perfection through agony might not actually be a sign of continuous scientific progress, but rather a symptom of profound, inescapable societal stagnation. They were trapped in a loop of their own absolute mastery.
Wow.
They endlessly tweak the variables of pain and suffering because it is the only variable left in their sterile world that produces a novel, unpredictable reaction. They have successfully conquered death, but they have utterly failed to find a meaningful purpose for the eternal life they secured.
They cured death, but they died of boredom, so now they just play with the meat to pass the time. That is incredibly bleak. It paints a picture of a society that is immensely powerful but completely hollow.
It is bleak, but it perfectly aligns with the thematic core of the text we've been analyzing. It shows that the pursuit of knowledge, when completely divorced from empathy, mortality, and higher purpose, ultimately becomes a closed, horrifying loop of self-indulgence.
Well, this has been an incredibly heavy, dense, and frankly fascinating journey through some very dark source material. I want to bring this deep dive to a close and summarize the core of what we've explored today.
Sounds good.
We've spent this time looking into a truly dark mirror of society, the homunculus covens of Cumorah. We've examined a civilization that completely conquered the fear of death, and in doing so, monetized resurrection into the ultimate political weapon.
We explored their bizarre societal structure, merging the protective, monopolistic economics of a guild with the gated knowledge of a school and the fanatical devotion of a cult. And we saw how they justify all of this through a deeply twisted, detached lens of art and poetry.
We took a horrifying tour of their living organic city, the Altered, which serves as a permanent fleshy testament to their absolute subjugation of biology. And ultimately, we arrived at the core terror they represent. What happens when cold clinical curiosity entirely replaces the moral compass?
It is a stark, extreme warning disguised as dark, speculative fiction. And I want to leave you with a lingering, real-world philosophical question inspired by this text. A thought for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends, as you go about your day.
Lay it on us.
If humanity ever reaches the pinnacle of biological mastery that these flesh sculptors possess, if we ever gain the ability to regenerate from a single cell, if we eventually cure death entirely and remove that final limit, would we inevitably lose our humanity in the process? Is it possible that our morality, our empathy, and our deep, abiding appreciation for the beauty of life are entirely dependent on our shared mortality?
Wow. If the X-ray machine of our own biology ever truly breaks and we conquer that final absolute limit. Wait, no, if we conquer that limit, do we stop being human? It really makes you wonder if that jagged white line on the bone isn't just a fracture to be fixed, but the very thing holding your empathy together. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. Keep questioning the boundaries of science. Keep thinking critically about the world around you, and we will see you next time.